Yes. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cloud Native Copenhagen Meetup. And today we are here with David. David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is David Heinemeier Hansson. I am the co-founder and CTO of 37 Signals, a SaaS company that's been making Basecamp for almost 20 years, a project management tool, and hey.com, a new email service. I have also created something called Ruby on Rails, a web development framework, and written a number of books. Rework, it doesn't have to be crazy at work. Remote, from all the way back in 2013. And I drive race cars at Le Mans. I think that is, yeah.
Do you still do that?
I do, yep. In a month, the 100th anniversary of the 24 Hours of Le Mans will kick off, and I'll be there for my 10th running. So, yeah.
Now you know what to watch that day. Great. So I will start off with a few questions. And if you have some questions, please just raise your hand and then we can do this interactively. That was also David's wish, not just us talking. So please just chip in if you have any good ideas, good questions you want to pick David's brain. So first off, I read the book. It doesn't have to be crazy at work. And I loved it, especially that part where you don't force your customer to upgrade to new version of product. I don't think that's how we see in the industry. So what's the intention of doing that? And what kind of challenge does it bring?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. When we started with Basecamp back in 2004, SaaS wasn't even a term that was used. Salesforce had just started a few years earlier, and they had the whole campaign about no software, that was a novel invention, that you would rent your software, you would use it as a service instead of buying it. And in those days, that took some convincing. And I think a lot of people jumped on the SaaS wagon because it was easier to do, there was no installation, and upgrades happened automatically. And when you sell that as a salesperson, that sounds like a universally good thing. Whenever there's a new feature or there's a bug fix, you just get it. There's nothing to install, there's nothing to do even. Well, that's all good and well as long as you like the things that are coming down the pipe. If you want to make bigger changes to your product, as we've done with Basecamp over the last almost 20 years now, it becomes a little more tricky. If you want to materially rearrange how that application is put together, where the screens are, what the flows are, there's a good book called Who Moved My Cheese? About UI design, about users learning to operate a system, being happy with that, and then some UI designers thinking, no, actually we should rearrange things because it'll look cooler or it'll be nicer. And maybe it does look cooler and maybe it is nicer for new customers, but it's often a real pain for existing customers. They've learned something, they're familiar with it, they don't want it moved around. They don't want any upgrades necessarily, they just want things to work as they do. The problem with that is that if you take one extreme, is you basically don't change your product, you just keep it static because the people who have it already, they love it. Well, if you have a product like ours that's been around for 20 years, if you try to sell a product that was designed 20 years ago in the marketplace today, difficult, right? Like the design sensibilities are not the same. Your ideas are hopefully not the same. If you've learned nothing in 20 years, I mean, condolences, that's not a good place to be. So what we found out along the way was that occasionally we had new substantial ideas on how to change how Basecamp worked, and we could not make that happen with the existing customer base. So the first time we did this was in 2012 when we released the second version of Basecamp, which was a complete rethink, a complete rewrite too. That's the other important part here, is that we had new ideas about how to attack the same problem that we've been solving at that point already for 6 years. We needed new technology. We wanted new designs. We wanted new concept. We wanted new features. It was a completely different thing. And for some SaaS companies, the natural thing would just be to force all your customers to upgrade, kicking and screaming. Maybe you are kind and you give them a 3-month notice that in 3 months we will change over to this. Here's a preview. But it's just coming. That is just what it is. And at the time we were thinking, you know what, we're doing a technical rewrite anyway. Why do we actually have to do that? What if someone just likes the old system and then they're happy with that? This is a SaaS business. The only thing we actually care about in terms of the business is that they continue to pay.
Exactly.
And I think one of the mistakes that some SaaS companies do when they roll out a major new version and they force everyone to upgrade is they force everyone back into market. If I have to learn a new version of the system anyway, well, I might as well maybe go with a competitor. And we're like, that seems like a bad idea. We could just keep the system around. So that's what we did. We still keep that system around. The original system that I started writing 2003, literally 20 years ago, is still running. We just moved it last week from the cloud back to our own servers. It's the same code base. It is still a multi-million-dollar business on a software that hasn't essentially moved for 13 years. No new features, no new nothing. That is the magic of, first of all, of SaaS, of the lock-in there is inherent in someone adopting a piece of software that they like, they want to continue to use. And then we did it again in 2016. We rewrote the whole thing again. So we run 3 different versions of Basecamp, 3 different cohorts of customers, no forced upgrades to anyone. We allow anyone who signed up, whenever they signed up, to keep the price that they had at the time forever, in part because it's cheap to run these old versions, and in part because that just feels like the right thing to do. So we ended up running 3 versions of our own system. For 3 different sets of customers. And I talk to customers all the time who run the original version, who are not just content with a piece of software that hasn't changed in 13 years. They love it. Okay. They're like, oh, Basecamp is my favorite piece of software. And I'm like, oh, yeah, which version are you on? The latest one? We just introduced this new feature. Oh, no, we're using Basecamp Classic. And I was like, wow, 13 years ago was when we stopped working on that, and you still love it. And of course, all these customers are at least 13 years old, because that's when we stopped selling that product. And in some cases, they are literally 20 years old. We have customers that's been around with us from the very beginning. Wow. It's pretty awesome.
How about the security patches and fixes, bug fixes and the CVEs? Those things come up, right?
They do. And that is one area. It's not free to keep these things around, but I think it's absolutely worth it. All the great companies that I look up to, the Porsches of the world, the Leicas of the world, they don't just service their legacy, they cherish it. It is a part of their brand that if you have a 911 from 1969 and something bad happens to it, you can get spare parts directly from Porsche. If you have a Leica M3 from 1942, you can send it to Germany and they will fix it. That is amazing. Yeah. So we really boiled this whole philosophy into a promise to our customers that we will keep around every major application we've ever made until the end of the internet. Or we go out of business, whatever comes first. So we keep all these products around. It's not just the old versions of Basecamp. We have a bunch of products we've made over the years. We made a CRM system called HighRise. We made a chat system called Campfire. All of these things. We made a free tool called Tadalist that we launched in 2005, a to-do list manager. We stopped offering it to new customers in 2009 or 10. Free. The whole time it was free. We're still running it for about 600 people a week, I think, use it. And I just take that like it makes no narrow economic sense to continue to service a product like that, but it makes me happy. It makes me happy that we're valuing our legacy as a software company in the same way that the great companies in the physical world value their legacy. And then it also serves as a great sort of canary. Whenever we want to do something new in terms of how we operate things, when we moved to the cloud, the first application that moved to the cloud was Tadalist. It was the lowest criticality. It did not even have any paying customers. If it was down for an hour when we moved, that was okay. And now when we moved off, Tadala was the first application we moved off the cloud.
Interesting. It's really nice. Respect of the heritage. It's a courage to do. Of course, it comes with the price you talk about, and it maybe also make your company to think every time we invent a new feature, is it worth it? We're gonna maintain this forever. Yeah. I think they will give the developer, designer additional thoughts on that.
Yes, it's funny. We're working on a couple of new products now, and these ideas that we have stuff in our company that's 20 years old. And when I go to look at that version of Classic, I go like, you know what? It still holds up. It's still pretty good. And having that sense of respect for the longevity of systems is something I think every software organization should build in. Software systems that are successful often wildly outlive the period of time people think that they would be around. We have systems in the US still running Fortran and COBOL from the 60s that are operating things like nuclear launch codes or social security payments. I'm sure there are things in the Danish system that are also very old systems. And I don't see that as a bad thing. A lot of programmers, when they say legacy code, they mean bad code. They mean, well, sometimes they mean code they wrote 6 months ago, but in most cases, they're not looking at that fondly. I look on that incredibly fondly. That is the history of my career. I started with 37 Signals literally 22 years ago. These are the trophies of a long career. We should all be so proud to have systems that last such a long time, even if they aren't exactly what we would build today. And I think customers really appreciate when we do. We get to contrast that to huge corporations like Google. There's a wonderful website called the Google Graveyard, I think, which tracks every single Google service that's ever been discontinued. There's hundreds of them at this point. And there's some large ones like Google Reader, for example, which was a very popular RSS reading tool that they killed in 2013, that people are still talking about that murder. And it's listed there on the Graveyard. And I think, you know what? We want to be the opposite of that. If we have an idea that we put into the world, that we ask customers to put their data into, to learn, do you know what? The least we can do is just keep the spare parts around and continue running it.
I hope everyone follows that kind of trend. It's interesting you talk about cloud exit. Now you're moving things up at that time, now you move it back. Are there any key factors others should look after that maybe it's a time for them to change, for them to exit? Because I think there are some good case for using cloud.
Yes. So I wholeheartedly bought the cloud pitch back in the mid-2010s, let's say. We'd been using cloud since S3 came out. I think we moved to S3 maybe in 2011 or something. So we'd been using cloud for a long time. And as a company, we kind of went all in about the mid-2010s, I think around 15 or something. And we bought in on the premise that the cloud, and when I talk about the cloud, I mean the rental cloud. When you're renting machines from someone else like AWS or GCP or Azure or whatever else have you, that there were going to be some economies of scale that were going to be so vast that it would not make sense for anyone to own their own computers anymore, or at least own their own servers anymore. Because how could we compete with Amazon buying 100,000 machines a month or whatever many they're buying? And of course, especially with Amazon, they would take those savings and then they would pass them on, because like that's Amazon.com is I think 3% margin business or something like that. That's the ethos of it. It was also the ethos that this was just going to get easier. Not only was the cloud going to make running the kind of applications we do much easier, we were going to be able to do it with less staff. So it was going to be cheaper, easier, and faster.
Faster to market, yeah.
I think the only thing out of those three that actually turned out to be true was speed. It is still very fast to provision 100 new servers. There's no way you can get 100 physical servers anywhere in the world in the 5 minutes it takes for them to spin up on any of the rental clouds. That's amazing. It is incredible that as a developer, you can have an entire fleet, a whole farm of servers available to you like that, right? I'm still amazed whenever I do anything with that realm. The other two things, not so much. It did not turn out cheaper. It did not turn out easier. And we tried very hard for a very long time to make those two things come true. I kept thinking, do you know what? We just need to get over the next hump. If we just upgrade to Kubernetes, do you know what? Then our problem is going to be solved, and we're going to be able to get by with a much smaller team, or the same team can do much more. Never happened. Not for lack of trying, not for lack of experts who were deeply into the material. It was just oversold. And that realization took a long time for us to get into. And part of it was because we invested so much into the cloud entry to begin with. Remember, we predate, as a software organization, rental clouds. So when we moved into the cloud, it was a serious effort to do. I actually thought that perhaps that was the biggest value of it, not running in the cloud, but converting to the cloud. There's a bunch of architectural principles that are incredibly sound, and that we've kept as we left the rental clouds. But the actual effort of getting into the cloud created this common fallacy of sunk cost. Okay, we've spent literally years converting this entire legacy of applications to run in the clouds. Now we've done it. Do you know what? If it's not cheap enough, if it's not easy enough, it's because we're not working hard enough. That conception lasted for years. I kept thinking that, you know what, it's close. And then I started getting some run-ins with the rest of big tech. I had some run-ins with Apple when we launched hey.com, our new email service, about getting allowed to even distribute a mobile app for it. Started thinking, you know what, that's not going in a good direction. I'd been around in the tech industry when Microsoft was sued by the Department of Justice for antitrust violations around tying their browser to the operating system. So had this conception all along that, you know what, the big tech companies might give us a lot of goodies, but they also take. And sometimes they take more than they give. And I think particularly around the mobile space, they were starting to take way more than they were giving. And then I started seeing some of these incidents around AWS, for example, US East 1, which is the main region for Amazon. Whenever that would go down, you'd get these write-ups in the media. Yeah, about a quarter of the internet is offline because like it just happens to be in US East 1. I'm like, what is this? I started working on the internet with the internet in the early to mid 90s. And the reason I fell in love with the internet was because it was a distributed, permissionless system where you did not have to beg any large corporation whether you would be allowed to connect to the internet. You could take your own computer and connect it to this wonder of the world, this incredible innovation that DARPA had originally put in place such that the US communication system could survive a nuclear attack. And we're rolling all that back by giving all the internet computing power to about 3 companies. I don't really want to be a part of that. So that was the seed that was growing in the back of my head. And then, as it often goes with these things, the fertilizer for that seed was seeing the damn bills. These damn incredible, unrelenting, ever-growing, obscene bills that I was receiving every month from AWS. We have publicized our accounting on cloud for 2022. We spent $3.24 million last year on cloud in total. That's a large number. If that number could be, say, $1.5 million less, we would keep $1.5 million more dollars at the end of the day. I own this company together with Jason, my partner, and you can do a lot of racing for $1.5 million. I'll tell you that. You know what? I'd rather do that than send another check to Amazon. So that was a realization that came later in the game, because when you first start doing these numbers, it's actually quite hard to compare total cost of ownership. Like, what do you factor in and what do you factor out? It wasn't until we started really digging into it, and also started digging into the other thing that's been happening in, let's say, the last 3 to 4 years, which is that, to me, hardware is finally exciting again. There was this lull period in the 2010s where Intel essentially just stood still for at least a good 5-6 years. Nothing happened on the chips. They weren't getting faster. Well, they were getting marginally faster, but they kept stumbling on their new nodes. So we're like, you know, a computer from 2013 versus a computer from 2016, same, not a big difference. And then suddenly what happened was Apple's incredible success with the iPhone, paired with its relationship with TSMC, really pushed computing chips forward. And at the same time, we had the NVMe revolution, where SSD drives were doubling in speed and capacity every 18 months. Those two things together over the last 3 or 4 years have meant that you have gotten so much more compute in such a small package at such a low price, yet none of the cloud seems to pass on those savings. So the gap between how much compute you could buy if you went to Dell or HP or something else and just paid for your machines versus what it costs to rent, which is going like this. So when we reran the numbers in last year, 2022, the math looked totally different than when we originally did the calculations 2016. I'm like, what is it? Weren't this supposed to be passed on? And then I felt actually cheated. I felt this was a violation of the agreement I thought I had, of course, never signed, just implicit from my part, with the big clouds, that they would pass on the savings. Then the other thing I realized was I looked at Amazon's results for 2022. AWS is the only profit center in the entire Amazon empire. It contributed about $40 billion worth of Amazon profits. Where do you think those profits came from? right here. It came from our pockets, right? $40 billion worth of profits, while Amazon is literally building a worldwide empire of data center. Yeah, that's it, right? Like the savings were not being passed off. Amazon was not treating AWS like a 3% retail business. They were treating it as an absolute monopolistically shaped cash cow. And you know what? I'd just rather keep the money myself. So all these things added up. We wanted our independence. We wanted to not contribute to the internet getting consolidated into 3 big suppliers. And we wanted to save a boatload of money.
So for how big organization you think it would make sense? Because I guess for small business, they probably still want the speed to market. They want their product to meet the customer first. But maybe for us as a bank, we also are looking at the cloud exit. Also think about, so we don't do vendor logging.
Yes.
So are there any size, if you give a rough number, so if you are hitting this number, or if you are running your business, how many percentage in the cloud? Maybe you should look into.
Well, for me, it kicks in quite quick. And one of the reasons it does kick in quite quick is we started in earnest our cloud exit in January. We had 20 years worth of applications that we had spent years putting into the cloud. And I thought we were going to take years to get out of the cloud. By the end of this month, we'll be done.
Oh, that's fast.
By the end of this month, we will be done pulling 7 applications, some of them minor, quite a few of them major, out of the cloud onto our own stuff. And I was actually shocked how easy that was. And I was shocked how easy it was because it was so hard to get into the cloud that I thought it'd be kind of similar. And that is the misconception, I think, with how difficult this is you're not going back to the old days. You're not going back to pet servers that have cute little names and some loving system administrator have spent like a week setting up just right? No. We live in the age of cattle servers, right? Like they're either producing or they're dead, right? And you're not sentimental about one server over the other. These are all running on containerization. They're all running on VMs. They're all running on essentially the same tech stack, whether it's in the rental clouds or a term I was trying to push this morning, sovereign clouds, your own cloud, a cloud you're owning by yourself. And this is the term I like using right now, that we're building a sovereign cloud, our own cloud for our own purposes with our own gear. And moving stuff from the rental cloud into the sovereign cloud is way easier than I thought it would be. For some organizations, if they're all bought into Kubernetes, for example, maybe that's easy. We were actually running Kubernetes. We looked at running Kubernetes on our sovereign cloud. No, thank you. Total clusterfuck. We were trying to do it through a vendor, SUSE. It was just an absolute dead end. Kubernetes is wonderful for the rental clouds or any organization large enough to have a team of, I think, at least 10 people dedicated to just that task. And if you have that, excellent. Run that on your sovereign cloud and be good with it. For us, the picture was to build some slightly simpler solutions, still using VMs. We use KVM, still using containers. We just use Docker. Orchestrate, I don't even like to use that word because it sounds too fancy. Deploying those containers using a new piece of glue technology we built called mrsk, that we built in just a few weeks to basically just instrument deploying a new version with Docker, doing the swap around, zero gap deployments, all that kind of stuff. But that transition, it being so easy, the fundamental conceptual compressions that are enabled by some of this technology, to me, has brought it way further down. That way earlier in your process as a company, is it something you could start thinking about? I would start thinking about it the first time I see a bill where I go like, that's a bit much, right? Like when you get to that sense that like it's real money and you can contemplate amortizing the gear you buy over 3 to 5 years. So if you are a startup that have not gotten product market fit, you've not validated, just don't buy a bunch of servers. That doesn't make any sense. Rent your VMs, rent all that stuff. But as soon as you have an ongoing operation where you can actually see 3 years out into the future, certainly a bank, I think you should start running those numbers, right? And I think then it doesn't, is the cutoff at $500,000 or €1 million or whatever, 5 million krooners or wherever it is, I think matters less than does it feel like it's too much. And for me as a business owner, like that's quite 3.2 million a year. Yeah, way too much. Part of this was informed by the fact we never fully left running our own stuff. We always had a few applications running our own stuff, so we never forgot that that was a possibility. I think this industry-wide amnesia is a huge part of the capitalization of the rental clouds right now, is that they've somehow convinced everyone that in like the last 5 years, every organization on earth lost the ability to operate servers connected to the internet. It was too dangerous. They couldn't figure out the security. Ew, touching hardware directly. Like, what? Amazing marketing campaign. Forever just in awe of what they've managed to do. Also total bullshit, right? So this fact that operating your own servers is not some sort of technology like the pyramids. How did they do it? How do you connect a machine to the internet? Like, okay, power here, Ethernet cable there, voila. It's not actually that difficult. Plenty of organizations are capable of doing it. You don't have to be that large. And if you are something like a bank, you should consider it as a core competency to be able to operate those things. So I'm also pushing the argument a bit, and partly is out of regret that I didn't push the argument earlier, and that we steered the entire industry into this obsession, this emperor has no clothes situation with cloud. I feel like there's a terrible sense of regret that someone should have said something earlier. So now I'm saying more and louder because I'm a little late, but at least it's being said. And I think that that's the important discussion to have, is just like reopening the solution space again. That like, okay, yeah, cloud could be an option, good, but also owning your own hardware could be an option. Like, just run the effing numbers. If you do, I would argue a very, very large percentage of current cloud deployments make no effing sense once you do the spreadsheet, once you look at the 5-year amortization. And I think that's just that. That's why I'm not even selling them. I'm just saying, like, run the numbers, because the numbers will talk for themselves. Once you do the spreadsheet, once you do the amortization, once you do the comparison, once you get a realistic quote from Dell, you don't look at list prices. No one effing pays list prices, right? You get your 60, 70, 80% discount off list. You do those comparisons, you go like, Jesus, what have we been doing in the cloud? You just go like, this is so much money. And then you look at Amazon's $40 billion profits out of AWS, and you go like, yep, there it is.
Yes. So run your numbers when you go back. Do we have people working from Microsoft, Google, or AWS here? You probably can.
Now, actually, this is the thing I like. So these big clouds, right? They, in essence, came to be off the back of open source software. Open source software is what drives all of these clouds, even Microsoft. And they got huge and whatever off that. But then they also started contributing back to that open source software to some extent, to some degrees, in some cases. Now we get to flip that around. It's like, all right, thanks for all the fish, and now we're out again. And all your contributions to the state of the art of containerization and virtual machines and all these other things, we can take those gifts back and use them on our own stuff. Like our entire setup for our cloud exit or sovereign cloud, whatever you want to call it, it's all open source. Not a single piece of enterprise, subscription support contract software is what I want to say. None of that.
See, wow, now we have hands up. Should we take in the first one first? Someone need to be rewarded to sit in the front.
Thank you. I don't need a.
We have online.
But I don't need it. I can just speak loudly.
Well, I think the camera won't hear it.
Oh, for the camera.
Yes.
Sorry.
Thank you. Why isn't there a 3% margin cloud business? If it's the same open source software, why doesn't that just exist as a service? Why do you have to run it yourself?
That is a great question, and one that still puzzles me somewhat. I think there are some inherent economies of scale, which are also evident by the fact that so AWS is this is a money printer for Amazon, right? It is not a money printer for Google. Google is still losing money on their cloud business. We ran in Google for a little while, and it's not because their prices are lower. They're essentially the same. So I think it's actually a difficult problem to create a full service, full globe rental cloud that has some very high entry barriers to create all of that. But once you pass those barriers, which Amazon clearly has, it is a money machine. So I think there's just not a lot of people who have the whatever 500 billion or trillion that Amazon has put into AWS at this point. So that creates these barriers of entry. Now, what's interesting to me actually is that there are some trying. In Europe, we have Hetzner, we have OVH, we have there's a third one I forget. So there's a couple of these mid-size clouds, you could say. They're not as fully featured, which, by the way, to me is a feature. The main drawback of AWS and so on is actually all the features, because all the features are just proprietary lock-in traps. So as soon as you do run something else than a VM, you're usually being locked into their services, and just makes it that much harder to get out. Heaven help anyone who fully committed to Lambda or whatever serverless bullshit that they're selling this week, because getting out of that, not easy. So condolences if that happens to apply to you, but the afterlife, there'll be another one, another round, another company where you can get out. I've not seen a lot of companies get out alive, unfortunately, from those traps, but new companies are started all the time, so we get to make new choices on a new go. But yeah, I think that is part of the problem, is to get to that scale is such a high barrier of entry, and then at the small scale, there's still a bit of an image problem to some extent. I think we are just at the precipice of a huge surge in European clouds. And I think it's going to all be driven by the GDPR. By the time the European Court of Justice for the third or the fourth time finally say, okay, no more bullshit, Max Streams was correct. The last 3 rulings we've made on this stuff, that you can't run your data in American companies, is actually the law, then I think it's going to switch, and a bunch of European companies are going to realize they can't place their stuff with Amazon or Microsoft or Google. And it doesn't matter whether those companies put their server in Iceland or the moon, they're still under US jurisdiction as US companies. The only thing that's going to save them in becoming fully compliant with the GDPR, and at least that provision about where the data is and who has access to it, is for the data to live in Europe by European companies. So I'm sort of waiting for that to sort of hit any day now. Yeah, I think it's one of those things where I actually hope we don't need the answer to some extent. I'd rather than us having a handful of clouds that are better priced or whatever, we have 10,000, 100,000, 1 million companies each owning their own servers and putting them in co-located data centers, of which there are hundreds, if not thousands, around the world.
So I started with Kubernetes and Rails at the same time back in 2017, and it's sort of a two-pronged question, because one of the things I remember from early Kubernetes was actually what you described. It was easy to get started. It wasn't very difficult. It didn't take a whole team of 10 people to maintain at the time. And then storage was a really big issue. Like, where do you put data so that it doesn't corrupt and it doesn't fall over? And I'd be curious to see, like, sort of how you solved that and what the issues that you had were, because I remember it as simple, but I mean, I've been working with it to this day, so I'm probably blinded by it.
Yeah, so this is a good amendment to our cloud exit by the end of the summer, which is our goal. Actually, I said end of the month. Let's see. There's always a bit of mop up. The applications will be out by the end of the month. The mop up will continue until the end of the summer. One caveat: we're not moving off S3 this year. So we have about 8 petabytes worth of data for all our applications. That is actually a surprisingly difficult problem still. Like 8 petabytes, like. I can't even, like, that's a lot, right? Like, even physically fitting the servers and the drives and whatever to keep 8 petabytes. Doing that redundantly across 3 data centers to have the right, all these guarantees and so on, even more difficult of a problem. We're committed to solving it. 2024, we will solve that problem one way or the other. I just don't have the answer today. I've got a lot of suggestions that come my way. Oh, you should try MinIO, you should try There's a bunch of things we're going to look into. I'd really like to end up also owning that hardware, but it's a more difficult situation. And actually, if there's any part of the AWS business that is running closer to that 3% margin business, it is S3. Like, that is actually, maybe they're only at a 30% margin instead of like a 10,000% margin like RDS or something. So it's not as easy to beat in a way that also feels ergonomically viable for us as a smaller company to do. But there are a bunch of people who try to solve that problem. So I'm sure it's solvable. But I saved that one for last.
Yeah, I was just gonna propose Ceph as a solution. We use that at least.
That was one of the other options that we've been recommended. One of the reasons why I'm hesitant here is that before we went into S3, we went through 3 enterprise storage solutions. I don't know if anyone is old enough to remember Isilon. We went through Isilon, CleverSafe, and there was a third one too. And this was actually a really formative experience. It cured me of any desire to ever work with any enterprise vendor who sells support contracts ever again, which is really helpful. Because what would happen with these enterprise storage companies would be that they would start out with some really interesting, novel, interesting technology, and we'd go like, wow, this is great, CleverSafe, Isilon, whatever. And then they'd have about an incubation period of 2 to 3 years where they were really cool. The original technology team was still around. You could talk to the people, like reasonably priced, and then inevitably they would get bought by IBM or EMC or Dell. And as second that lasted, you could start your timer. In 9 months, the price is going to get jacked up by 180%, and anyone answering your support calls won't know the fuck they're talking about. So that was just, once you've gone through that for the 3rd time, you go like, yeah, do you know what? No, not doing that again. Open source all the way, open source or bust.
Yeah, Ceph is open source. We use.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I was just
Otherwise,
in that
open
whole
source.
space. Sometimes there's open source and then there's open source. Like most of these enterprise vendors or anyone who want to sell you on these things, to me, Kubernetes is like at least one of these on the open source in terms of running it yourself. That there's a lot of enterprise vendors who will sell your service contract to run it for you. That was the blind alley we went down in the first place. And it needs to be so simple that I can figure it out. If I can figure it out and understand it and feel like, okay, if I dedicate all my time, but just me and no one else to it, like I would feel comfortable running this, we're not doing it. For me, Kubernetes does not pass that bar, at least for running it ourselves, doing our own control plane upgrades and all the other hairy stuff. And yeah, so we got to find that on storage. Maybe Ceph is that. I have not actually looked in depth detail on any of this stuff yet.
Oh, hi. Thanks for the talk. I was wondering about the data migration, because like that's the part that's intriguing for you right now. And I was remembered that like AWS provides ways to pick up your data from your own data center to AWS using like the snowmobile, like the largest one, or the snowball. So it's easy to pick up your data to their own data center, but they don't make easier to get the data out. So when I was wondering about your blog post about moving your stuff out of the cloud, I was considering that maybe it's the moment for us to have like some sort of a law or regulation that could be just called like data sovereignty. So you should own your data in terms of like, I want to take my data out of your data center because then maybe I have like a best offering for like another cloud provider, or you want to host the data on your own data center. So how about your thoughts about actually having this kind of law?
Yeah, S3 is a roach motel. You can check in very easily, you can't get out. That is absolutely true. I think the bill we looked at right now for migrating our 8 petabytes was over $300,000. Just getting the data out. The egress fees are insane. And of course, the ingress fees are free.
Yes.
It costs nothing to put 8 petabytes in, and it costs over $250 million to get it out. I think that it absolutely is ripe for regulation to some extent, that we have all sorts of regulations about how companies need to act to be fair in the marketplace. This is a huge lock-in factor. So yeah, I would welcome that. If it's going to come from anywhere, it's probably going to come from the EU. So let's see if something's going to happen on that. But do you know what? At this point, I would still, it's just, we spend about $900,000 a year on the 8 petabytes, and that is through heavy optimization, long-term pricing, private pricing, the whole thing. I think the list price for 8 petabytes is something just under 2 million. So we're at 900K. So even at those numbers, though, I mean, paying 300 to get out is still going to work out. But yeah, I don't like it at all. I actually, yeah, it's a really sly, bad move. Also because if you look at the egress prices and what the cost actually is, like, is this based in cost? No, it's not. I think they're overcharging the bandwidth outs by like 1,000% or 10,000%, something ridiculous. It's really there to just keep you locked in.
Up there. But in the meanwhile, while you have some data in S3 and now moving things back to on-prem? How about the data? So you just read some part of the data up there? Or?
Yes, so we do mostly direct uploads. So we direct uploads and direct downloads. So even though we run our application somewhere else, the majority of the storage that we do just happens directly to and from S3.
Okay.
But sometimes that's not true. Like if you got to process images and you got to download them and then transform them and put them back up, yeah, that's also a tax.
All right. So my question is like, if a different cloud provider, and I speak for quite a few people in this room, like we are personally using Azure, would that change your exit strategy? And what I'm trying to do, kind of just give a bit more context, is when you're going into that direction, you're not only marrying yourself into infrastructure, but also the whole ecosystem. So they provide you with a set of tools to streamline processes and et cetera, et cetera. Those things are exactly, yes, but those things are very difficult to measure in terms of cost. What's the impact towards your teams and so on and so forth. So yeah, maybe you can say a few words, like would that change your exit strategy?
So I have this weird personality that like the harder someone tries to hold on to me as a customer, the more I want to get out. So to me, that's just additional motivation to get out. It's the same thing with the S3 lock-in. All these forms of lock-in, whether it's technology or it's workflows or it's cost, is to me evidence that something shady is going on. Like you wouldn't, if I was just here as a happy customer, loving everything, but could leave any time, that seems like a relationship I want to be in. I don't want to be in the kind of relationship where the lock-in kind of feels like that's just part of the package. Now, I get also that even if it wasn't locked in or something else, that there's some ergonomic affordances to running in the cloud that can be very nice. I mean, we've been running one of our services, hey.com, on RDS, for example. That's a very nice system for managing upgrades and backups and so on. And some of that stuff we had to replicate to some degree, yes. But I will say about, at least what I found, and this is particular to each application, but for us, the vast majority of like all the hard work in this stuff was open source software anyway. There was a bit of a learning curve on a couple of things where we had to take some things in-house. But when you look at the savings, like it seemed like a pittance for us to pay to set up these things like Login or Kibana or Prometheus or any of these other solutions. Like, I used to get it managed. It was very nice and easy and just a toggle to turn it on. Now there's a bit of setup work that we have to do. Okay, yeah, that's the business we're in. We sell software. We should be competent in the tools that we use for it. Again, that does not mean that there's not a transition period. This was why I actually thought we were signing up for a multi-year journey getting out of the cloud, because I thought we'd hit way more blockers in workflows and tooling and whatever. And then once we started getting on the road, we actually learned that a bunch of it we could do without. Some of it was nice to haves, not needs to haves, and other things were not nearly as hard as we thought. All that depends on your application. And like the whole Microsoft ecosystem is almost its own. I think that's why Azure has gotten such takeoff, because it lives in its own universe, a little bit sort of separate reality almost from the rest of the open source community. So I don't actually know anything. The last time I used any Microsoft technology was ASP back in '97. So very outdated on that front. And what I know more about is sort of the rest of the open source world. Now, these things are actually starting to overlap more and more. But there may very well be specific things you're like, yeah, you know what, we can't replicate this, or it doesn't work with our Microsoft specific workflows or whatnot. So maybe the equation is different. But from what I've seen on pricing, we did look at Azure at one point, because they also can run any application there's not any material difference. So the numbers per se were not going to look that different whether we were using that, or as we were for a while on Google Cloud, we also use that, or on Amazon.
I have a question online. David, can you tell more about the mrsk.dev and your plan for that, and how the community can get involved in that?
Yes. So mrsk is the only really piece of new technology, if you will, that we built specifically to afford this, or not afford, but provide an affordance for the cloud exit. And it is basically a way to remote instrument swapping Docker containers around such that you don't have any downtime when you deploy a new version of your application. Because what I found was we were using Kubernetes before through EKS at Amazon. And then we're like, okay, we're going to try to look at like, okay, there's some nice things here. We get zero downtime deploys. We get rollbacks. We get a bunch of these things. We need those things. We need to deploy new versions of the app. We can't have downtime. We need to be able to roll back. We weren't going to run Kubernetes. Once we realized that, I felt like, okay, let's look at something else. Let's look at Docker Swarm. Okay, here's another orchestration form. And I kept just thinking, like, I don't understand most of this. Like, why is this so complicated? I've literally been in technology for 20 years. I've built frameworks. I'm like trying. I've read 2 books in Kubernetes. Like, I'm really trying to get into it and just go like, this seems hideously complicated for what we're trying to do. I mean, our customers don't give 2 hoots whether we run on Kubernetes or a pet server that I lovingly set up for 3 weeks, right? They don't care. Yet somehow the Kubernetes stuff and even to some extent the Docker Swarm stuff seems so complicated for what we're trying to do. Now, I totally get if you're running a rental cloud for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of customers and you're constantly moving things around, that's a different problem. For that problem, I am sure Kubernetes is a wonderful, loving thing. Us, no. We run like, what do we run? 12 applications. A fair number, but not that many. We have about, what, 1 million daily users? Okay, a good bit, but not that many. We have about 100,000 customers. All right. Again, we're not internet scale. We're not Meta. We're not whatever, right? And for that problem, Kubernetes and a lot of the other cannons just seemed like so huge, and all I needed was like a squirt gun, right? So we went back to the drawing board. I went back to the drawing board and said, like, I love Docker. Like, I was a late adopter to Docker, but when I really dove into it, I think it's one of the most beautiful pieces of software, like the whole concept of it and how coherent the implementation of it and how simple the underlying Docker engine is and how you operate with it was a real marvel. Like the last time I saw something like that where I went like, hats off, was probably Git or whatever, MySQL before that. Like, there's not that often that happens to me. And I went like, why do we need more than this? We basically have all of it minus a couple of things on how to just tweak things and update applications. So mrsk was that answer. Just take Docker, like lean on that for 97% of everything we need, and then add the last 3% to give nice economics to update your app, do rollbacks, and so forth. And it's basically built on the same philosophy of another deployment tool that we built at 37 Signals way back in the day called Capistrano, which just connects over SSH to your hosts and then execute commands. Okay, start new container. Wait for container to be healthy. Once container is healthy, stop the other one, swap them around, reconfigure load balancer, all that kind of stuff. Not that complicated, but still needed. Unless you have that, you're like, oh, well, I need something. And Docker Swarm is like half abandonware and also has some holes in it. And Kubernetes is really the big other answer. And I will absolutely forgive anyone who like, oh, maybe I'd like to move out of the cloud. And then they pick up a Kubernetes book and go like, actually, no, I don't. Right? So lowering the barriers of complexity. Again, if you are an organization who can afford the big team that knows everything about Kubernetes, more power to you. That's wonderful. We were not that. And we even have a 10-person operations team. Right? Not like we're a tiny company. We're about 80 people at the company. More than half of it are technical. And still, it felt too much for me. So mrsk is that answer. Instead, it's not that big, but it's really seemed like it struck a chord. We pushed it out as open source. I started writing it January 12th of this year. About 3 weeks into it, we were using it to deploy the first app. About 5 weeks into it, we had deployed List with it. We've now deployed 5 applications running it, including this Basecamp Classic thing, multi-million-dollar application we're running it. We're using it in anger in production to do real stuff with. And it feels like it's kind of taken off with a good community already. We have about 5,000 stars, whatever that means, on GitHub. And I think about 30 contributors already who've have patches to it that are outside of our organization. So I think like there was space here. There are other solutions. There's a billion solutions. There's some called Nomad. There's this, that, and the other thing. There are other things you could do. All of them, I felt like not quite right. I also just have this tendency to make my own tools for everything. We basically build our tools for everything we do at 37 Signals, Ruby on Rails, and all this other stuff. So it didn't feel like a far stretch for us to do that. But yeah.
Have you looked at the WebAssembly yet?
Yes, a bit. And it's so funny. I was reading this interview or seeing this comparison, WebAssembly and Docker and so on. And then I saw someone else's commentary on it. Like, I don't think the Docker people understand like the simplicity and beauty of what they build and why people use it. So I think sometimes people who are very technically gifted, the people who build Docker and that held setup, who are also very excited about WebAssembly. I saw this quote: "Oh, if WebAssembly had been around when Docker was created, we'd never created Docker." Like, I don't know. I don't care. Like, that's not a level of concern that I have about things. If it runs on WebAssembly instead of something, fine. Give me the ergonomics and the ease of use of something like Docker, and like, great. So, yeah.
Okay, go back to Maersk. I saw it wasn't GA yet. Do you have a plan or small roadmap? Say, hey, in 2 months it will be GA. I know you are using it in production.
No. The roadmap is much clearer than that. By the time we move out the last application, we will go 1.0.
Okay.
So that is hopefully in about a month. I mean, we're already using it for 5 major applications, and I think it's on the 9th, so in 6 days, we will start moving hey.com, which is the major application that was cloud native, built for cloud, blah, blah, off. And on the 16th, I think we're scheduled to be done. By the time we move all that up, we will have validated that, like, this is proper, you can use it, whatever. Not that we might still make changes to things, but like, we're rapidly moving towards 1.0. And of course we are, to some extent, because like, we're not doing the hard work. All the hard work was already done by Docker. It is a battle-tested technology that's been around for so long. We're just like making it easier to use it for this specific purpose.
Very nice.
So I also have a question actually about the Maersk. So how are you managing all the procedures, like all the commands that you need to execute if you have like multiple containers that you need to manage? Because this is something that maybe in the cloud would be, you know, managed by services like CloudFormation, or maybe, yeah.
Yes, and this was one of the reasons why I got so excited about Maersk, is I started looking at our Helm charts. Anyone who's worked with Kubernetes knows those. And I just looked at those and you know what? This reminds me of all the worst excesses of J2E from the early 2000s. Like remote server beans and all this other stuff, like 4,000 lines of XML configuration to set up your application server. And I just went like, we're just repeating the same shit over, like we're rebuilding the Death Star one time after the other. Like first it was J2E, then it was WS Star, all this nonsense that went on. And I think like a fair number of those people, or at least that mind virus, went straight into the creation of the Helm charts. Now, no offense to anyone who's a huge fan of Helm charts, perhaps. When I first opened them, it's just like, this is no. So we ended up with the Maersk declaration file, which is sort of imperative. This is one of the big philosophical differences. We're not converging anything. I don't know. Can we swear on? Like, I guess I'm already past this point. I guess it's too late. I fucking hate convergence as a philosophy of managing large systems, like state conversion. That like, okay, I describe state A, and then here's state B, and like magic will get us from state A to state B. No. I also don't like functional programming so much. I like object-oriented programming. I fully respect that there are people who can have different opinions, and it's not that. I'm just giving my opinion here, right? I like to see the commands being executed. I like to know what they are. So in the Maersk declaration of things, you just say like, here are my hosts. Here's the image I want to run on these hosts. Here's some accessories perhaps that I'll run next to these things. It's not that complicated. Like the biggest deploy.yaml file, we also use YAML. It only really goes haywire once you start putting conditional logic in there. So we're staying away from that. But they're tiny, right? Like we went from literally, I did the git diff thing, like minus 8,000 lines of code plus I think 400 lines of code when we did the diff on one of the apps that had just Helm charts coming out the wazoo. That it just compressed into this. I didn't even know. Is this your question? I'm just going off on hatred to state. Yes. Yeah. So yes, good question. So in terms of like, I'm looking. What are we trying to do? Trying to deploy new software. We're trying to roll back software if it doesn't work. We're trying to maybe look at some log files if something went bad. I start from the use cases, right? Then I put all the workflow logic, if you will, into mrsk. So the mrsk is executing these things, but you get to see each line that's being done. And it's all being described from this deploy.yaml file that's about like, for our apps, mostly 40 lines of code. There's no comprehension burden because it's so simple. And everyone on the team understands basic Docker, right? So this is also a huge advantage that we had like Helm chart experts, which was a smaller group inside of our larger group who like really knew that stuff. It was not a body of knowledge that could easily be distributed because it seems like it's like taking a second PhD, right? To actually get proficient at the high level of doing this because the complexity is just so towering high. And I just went like, you know what? I've tried to understand it. I've really put time and effort into learning it. I'm not going to. I refuse to learn anything that requires 4,000 lines of XML. No, I'm not doing that. So we have to find a different way where I personally can understand this if I put my mind to it for 2 weeks. If I can't understand it in 2 weeks, we're not doing it. Docker and this setup and mrsk and so on that fall under that category of like someone new for our team. We just had this. So someone joins the cloud exit endeavor here, never worked with any of our stuff before, never worked with the mrsk setup and so on. I just like pointed him to a repo and like, you do it. And we're launching in 3 weeks. Yeah, all right, cool. We launched that app. That was the one we launched last week. That was Basecamp Classic, done by someone who had not been part of the cloud migration process. Otherwise, no way in a billion trillion years could I have told that person, hey, you know what? Here's all the Helm charts. Like, get from Amazon to Google Cloud. No. So that's part of like conceptual compression is what I like to call this. You take something that is like, here's a thing we want to do, right? It has all these moving parts. And the reason it has all these moving parts is just sometimes because some of the philosophies are wrong or overshot or broken or whatever. And some of it comes out of the fact that some of these technologies, especially Kubernetes, where was Kubernetes born? At Google. Trying to solve what? Like all the servers in the universe. Like that was their problem space, right? Like we got to be able to run google.com off this. Is that an appropriate level of complexity for us? No, it is the inverse. It is the opposite. And I find that with a lot of technologies, anything that comes out of a organization with 100,000 engineers trying to solve problems at the scale of billions will be more often than not exactly the opposite of what a company of 80 trying to serve 100,000 customers need. Again, I don't even know if I'm answering your question here. Sorry.
We have one more question.
Yeah. Hi. So you have the exit strategy, you have the tools, but what about like data centers? So in Iceland, for instance, they're launching a lot of data centers, but the electrical grid is, kind of failing the country. Electricity prices are going up. That mid-sized cloud provider in Germany, they had like their entire data center burned down, I think. There's been flooding at Amazon or whatever. How do you, as a company, mid-sized company, pick where to place these data centers, how to like run them, who's gonna run them? Like, yeah.
Good question. I think the fundamental answer is just pick two. It doesn't matter. Odds that both of them are going to go out at once, very low. That's a little blip. Longer version is redundancy. You don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? In fact, the reason we left GCP, the Google Cloud, in the first place was because in 2019, we suffered over 2 weeks 3 horrendous outages of, I think one was 6 hours, one was 4 hours, another one was 5 hours. This was supposedly from the smartest people in the universe, setting up their setup in such a way that it was infinitely redundant, right? Bullshit. Like, at the end of the day, they're servers, and people configure them, and they break. And the only way to consistently have them not break is to have duplicates of everything, far away from each other, not connected at all. Kudos to AWS that they figured this out. I think it was in 13 or 14 where they completely rewrote how their network stuff works such that each individual region are completely separate. GCP did not get that clue when they set up their global network. That was the problem we ran into. What we do is we have 2 data centers. We have one in Illinois and we have one in Virginia. They're like, I don't know, 1,500 miles apart. Likelihood that they're both going to be swallowed up by something at the same time, very low. We run full redundancy, so any individual data center can run the whole app. That's enough for us. If you're a bank, I was just on a podcast this morning. I heard there's actually a banking regulation saying you need 3 spots. Okay, fine, have 3. I don't think this is you're not facing a unique challenge compared to the rental clouds, the large rental clouds. And I don't think for most people, most of the time, it's that difficult. The key thing is to have more than one. We used to run in a single data center. It was a data center in Austin operated by Rackspace, and a truck drove straight into the generator, and it was offline for like 48 hours. And after that point, we were like, never 1 DC again. And we spent like 2.5 years getting to 2 DC setup.
One little bit out of time, so
We'll take a last one.
Yeah, thank you very much for
we
participating.
actually have one, but we say for you as yes, last you. We'll end as you, so we go full circle. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much for participating. I have questions regarding the culture. Of course, 37 Signals hires 80 people, and you can be very picky about who you're hiring. I'm consulting for a company that hires thousands of people, which are around autonomous teams. And as you can imagine, there is various sets of skills in every team. But those people are super brilliant, have to write code. Unfortunately, this intelligence comes with the lack of software skills. It's reflected in the product being delivered. How do you elevate the culture of writing quality software in such organizations? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, as it relates to both cloud and everything else, like thinking that like Amazon or anyone else is able to hire like just brilliant people who are all perfect and do everything amazingly is a folly, right? Like I think this level that if your setup and your operation can only be operated by the smartest people in the world, like statistics will tell you will fail. So I like to invest in like upgrading the environment. Making sure that we have an environment where reasonably smart people can get up to speed and work with. This is what I've been trying to do with Ruby on Rails. This is in part what we're trying to do with mrsk. Compressing complexity is a way to bring down the bar. So I think this is I'm not sure I fully understood the question, but if I understood it, like that's my answer to that part of it is like, how do you deal with the fact of these varying skill levels and so on? It's often something I get with the cloud conversation that people go like, well, I mean, we can't attract the same caliber of people as you can. First of all, I think that's bullshit. Second of all, I don't think it's necessary. And also, literally, again, the entire world ran like this. They ran their own servers, they ran their own setups, they ran their own applications like 5 years ago. Right? Like with the quality of people who were right around at the time. It's not like the entire world has just leveled up, like it's the same quality of people. So I think there's a huge part of FUD in this, where there's this misconception that, particularly on the cloud question, that like Google and Amazon just have like a special species of engineers that no one else can even approach, and that they are so smart that they do flawless work, and it's just utter nonsense.
Thank you.
Great. Let's take the last one.
Thanks a lot. I just wanted to wrap up to hear a little bit about Le Mans. You won a race. Why do you decide on this kind of endurance racing?
Yeah, so the quick version is like I did not get my driver's license until I was 25, living here in Copenhagen. I like to convince myself I didn't need a car, but the real answer was I couldn't afford a car. But then I moved to the US in 2005 and got a fun car. 2 years later, a friend took me to a racetrack. I was like 27. I go like, this is fun. I would like to do this more, like all the time. Could I please? So for a few years, I just really dove into that. And then things were taking off with the company at the same time. I was like, all right, if I'm going to just set fire to all the money we save on cloud, like let it be race car driving. And Tom Christensen at the time was just like winning every Le Mans ever. So I was like, that'll be the goal. I'll set my sights to that. And I just tried to get there as quickly as I could. And 5 years later, from like sitting in a race car for the first time, I was at the Grid of Le Mans in 2012. It's just, yeah, it's a wonderful hobby. There's a lot of similarities around like how to run a company. These racing teams are essentially small companies, and not even so small. I think our team right now has about 60 people coming to Le Mans to operate 2 cars. It's actually mid-sized organizations with all these differences of trying to shake people together really quickly, because you have 1 year to make it count. And oftentimes you only have a few months because that's your first race, and you're meeting a bunch of new people, and you got to figure things out. And like, I think it's a fascinating problem. And then the driving itself is just an engineering, optimizing, get in the zone kind of problem, and you get a result like every 2 minutes. Like, okay, that was how quick that lap was. Absolutely love that. Huge comparison for me to programming, where the best sort of state of flow is you forget everything else and you're just engrossed in it. Race cars provide that with like the push of a button, because if you are not fully focused at 342 kilometers an hour as we were going down the Mulsanne Strait, like you could die. So like that really focuses the mind in a way that I find very therapeutic.
That's really nice. That's right. We didn't get to ask in the part about how to run a calm company. Actually, I really would like to ask that. I don't know if you can just very quick cover that part. So if we want to have a calm company, how do we get started? Because in bank, we are always very busy.
Yeah, I'll give you the shortest and most glib answers. And apologies for anyone who holds these positions here. You fire all the middle managers and you make sure that all the executives have hobbies. Absolutely the worst thing that can happen to any small, mid-sized, and even reasonably large company is to have full-time managers and full-time executives, because they have too much time on their hand to come up with bullshit ideas all the time for the people who actually do the work to get disturbed with. And we try this very hard. I am not a full-time CTO. I do CTOing like 10 hours a week sometimes, and like the most glorious weeks, 0 hours a week, because I have a hobby. I like to program. I like to make things, and that's what I do. Jason, who's the CEO and my partner in the business, he likes to design. He likes to write. He just wrote about this, Jason Fried on LinkedIn. You can find this article about how CEO for him is a part-time position. Even at this company of 80 people doing hundreds of millions of kroners a year in revenues, treated as that. I think you just get such a calm when it's no one's job to constantly interrupt other people. So that's probably the number one. The second one I would say is to get rid of all meetings and replace them with asynchronous written communication. I mean, not all meetings, but like virtually most of them. I have weeks, they're glorious, not as frequent as they used to be, where there's literally nothing on my calendar. Like, it is possible, and it's not actually that difficult. Again, get people to write down their updates and pitches and whatever. Save your meetings for when you're like terribly at odds and can't get to terms. Upgrade that conversation to a meeting. They're quite few if you have a company that sort of is reasonably well run. And well run in that sense mostly means absentee-ly run. That the well-run people think like there's someone doing some all the time. To me, the most well-run companies are when there are very few people doing just a little bit, quite rarely, in terms of management and organization. Again, not all the time, total characterization, but yeah.
So not too much meetings.
We have a essay in Rework literally called "Meetings Are Toxic." So there's good reading material on that, and more on that topic. Yes.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for coming.